So I am just old enough, and I emphasize just old enough, to remember doing nuclear bomb drills in elementary school. To this day, I'm not exactly sure why hiding it on my desk was going to protect me from a nuclear warhead, but it did serve one purpose, certainly, which was to scare the bejeebers out of me for years at the threat of global nuclear war. I do actually even remember as a young person at times thinking, why would I work hard at anything, because surely the world as I know it will be over by the time I'm an adult. Of course, with the benefit of hindsight, we now know that those Cold War tensions abated over time and sanity prevailed, and although the risk of nuclear war is not zero today, it is certainly not something that's quite as prevalent on our minds as it once was. Having survived that, then in high school, I learned that it was the hole in the ozone layer that was going to kill us. And I'm sure many of you would remember that. And in the early 1980s, scientists discovered a thinning of the ozone layer over Antarctica, and that if it continued on that trajectory, was going to spell significant problems for humanity. Thankfully, the scientists over a couple of years figured out the source of the problem, and it was man-made chemicals, CFCs largely, that were used in refrigerants and aerosols, and they were breaking down the ozone molecules. So armed with that knowledge, the world mobilized, and academia kept doing their important scientific work. Industry started working on alternates and replacements for CFCs, and governments got involved in regulation, culminating in the landmark 1987 Montreal Protocol, which 129 countries signed to ban and phase out the use of ozone-depleting substances. By any measure, it was a resounding success. And since that time, the ozone has been restoring itself, and it's on trajectory to be back to pre-1980 levels by the middle of the century. And had I not mentioned it today, probably none of you have thought about the threat of the ozone layer for years, if not decades. Well, that wasn't enough. Into my adult years we go, and now we became aware of the dangers of anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions and what that was doing to the climate. And yet again, we had this big, intangible global crisis that was, very, very serious and also very, very challenging to manage. But as opposed to the first two, which I lived through in complete fear, to be honest, by this time, having had those lived experiences of seeing us collectively do hard things and tackle some of these really thorny challenges, I actually became an optimist. And to this day, I remain an optimist that we will solve the climate challenge. I won't stand here and say it's going to be easy, and it will be a lot harder than the ozone was, because the ozone layer, ultimately, it was a handful, a finite number of chemical facilities around the world producing those chemicals, and it was relatively easy to find economic alternatives and phase those out, and the rest is sort of history. But greenhouse gas emissions come from a wide range of sources, spanning industry and consumers and north and south and rich and poor and natural and anthropogenic, and in many cases there aren't today viable economic alternatives to some of those activities that generate GHG emissions. So it is much, much harder for sure. But I still do fundamentally believe that we will get there. I'm also equally confident there's no one silver bullet solution for climate change. It will be a raft of solutions and technologies across global supply chains and all parts of life. We, of course, learned, too, that fossil fuels, when combusted, are one of the primary sources of greenhouse gas emissions in the world. And that's problematic because we all know that since the Industrial Revolution, fossil fuels have underpinned modern energy systems in the global economy. Drilling down more specifically to oil also, of course, a major contributor, but an absolutely foundational part of modern life. And whether it's the transportation fuels that get us to and from work, or to visit a friend, or to go on a vacation, the fact that we can eat fresh fruits and vegetables in northern climates in the winter, in our plastics, in our clothing, on the roads we drive on, oil is ubiquitous and incredibly intertwined with modern society. So that will be a big challenge to address. Now, I don't say that in any way to suggest that because oil is so foundational that we should ignore the climate impacts. I'm saying, in fact, the exact opposite, that because it's so foundational, we have to double and triple our efforts to address those emissions, parallel path with developing non-emitting sources of energy, and that is the fastest way to bring down global greenhouse gas emissions. The oil sands industry is completely committed to being part of this very, very big global solution. And there's an important role we can play in our member companies. The members of the oil sands operators and producers have been doing R&D and spending billions of dollars for decades on all aspects of their business, including environmental. About a decade or so ago, we created Canada's Oil Sands Innovation Alliance to allow us to accelerate the sharing of environmental technologies and accelerate their deployment without IP barriers and those kind of things that often get in the way. That's been very successful. And it's not limited to just greenhouse gas emissions. That expands to other environmental media, be it tailings, air, land, water, et cetera. Now, of the whole suite of technologies we're working on, probably the one that comes to the forefront for the near term is carbon capture and storage. And the oil sands is particularly well suited to CCS because ultimately the emissions come from a relatively finite handful of sources, and we're approximate to really, really high quality geology to permanently and safely sequester those emissions. But it is in and of itself a massive undertaking. It's a 450-kilometer pipeline, another 250 kilometers of gathering lines, all the capture infrastructure at the oil sands operations to capture the CO2, aggregate it, and bring it south for sequestration. Why am I confident we can execute this? Well, because our industry only exists because we are incredibly good at tackling these complex technical challenges. Oil sands is a hard resource to develop and commercialize. It's been known about for hundreds of years. It comes to the surface in various areas, but really, in a commercial application, it was long thought to only be useful as maybe a paving material. But to the credit of those early pioneers of the industry, they're a plucky bunch, and they wouldn't take no for an answer. They knew the size of the prize that was there. And so starting as early as 1929 is when they patented the first hot water separation process to remove the oil from the sand and clays that hold it. And that spawned this entire industry. But it was by no means an overnight success. Even having cracked that nut, it was still another 30 years until the first commercial oil sands mine opened in 1967. The great Canadian Oil Sands Company, which is, of course, now Suncor. And that's because they had to develop all of the mining equipment and tools and doing the separation at scale and upgrading and all those other things that come with it. And an absolutely incredible accomplishment. And frankly, even after launching commercially, it was decades till they were profitable. But it was led by a consortium of industry and government and academia and working in collaboration to get that resource to a commercial state. The same played out on the in situ side. So this is the 80% of the resource that's too deep to mine. They needed a way to extract that oil. And Imperial in the 1960s figured out that they could inject steam deep underground that would mobilize the heavy oil and it could come up as a hot emulsion. And that spawned the Cold Lake oil sands operations as we know them today. In the 1990s, with the advent of horizontal drilling, they were able to put a twist on that steam injection and develop steam-assisted gravity drainage, or SAGD, which is then opened up an entirely another huge tranche of the resource. And all that cumulative effort over 60 years, and to date, about $1 trillion in investment, has resulted in us having today this incredibly technically sophisticated oil sands industry producing 3.3 million barrels of oil a day, cost competitive with other competing jurisdictions, and sitting on the fourth largest oil reserve in the planet. Like that is a really great stage to now operate from, to continue to be a global oil supplier of choice, to be a huge part of addressing global energy security, and an incredible vehicle for Indigenous economic reconciliation as we learn to develop those resources in partnership with those Indigenous communities in true co-development. this huge national treasure that we now have. But we have now at least one more frontier to conquer, which is carbon. And we have to now take that business and transition it to be carbon competitive. And yeah, will that be hard? Yeah, it will. But again, I have every confidence, based on the track record I've described, that we will be able to solve that problem. Now, the one thing that worries me a little bit is, as I look back when we launched Pathways about 3 years ago, perhaps naively in hindsight, I assumed that it would be universally well received that industry was coming together with this great ambition to develop this large CCS project and all these other technologies to improve our environmental performance. And broadly it has, and I certainly don't want to suggest that there's not a lot of support and people who understand the value proposition, but there are also important voices who oppose CCS, and they don't want to see these kind of projects go ahead because they're not immediate 100% solutions. They're incremental steps. It doesn't address the problem overnight. And that's not coming from a bad place. When you think of the gravity of the climate imperative, it's understandable that people want to see that progress as fast as they possibly can. But I'm speaking to a room of very technically savvy technology people. I don't have to preach. I think I'm preaching to the choir here when I say, like, that's not how technology development works. It takes lots of time. I can't think of a single human technological breakthrough that wasn't the result of years, if not more likely decades, of trial and error and refinement, and even sometimes a helping of luck to finally get to that point of commercialization. And so I do worry a little bit that we spend too much time in boardrooms on whiteboards planning out this ideal carbon transition pathway that is never going to be achieved because it's only in our minds and it's not in practice how technology is developed. You have to take 1,000 first steps and try a bunch of things and you'll fail, but you have to believe in the power of the market. You have to, of market forces. You have to believe in the huge army of entrepreneurs around the world that are working on this, and governments and academia and industry. That collective body is incredibly powerful. And that's kind of my call to action to this group of extremely influential people, is let's not let ideological perfectionism become the enemy of progress. People oppose CCS because it's not a 100% solution. That same line of thinking leads us to oppose natural gas displacing coal because it's not a 100% solution. And blue hydrogen is no good because it's not a 100% solution. And nuclear is no good because it has waste streams that need careful management. That is not the path to solving this problem. The path to solving the problem is to ignite and launch the collective creativity and market forces that will try a million things. And again, as technology savvy people in this room, you know that oftentimes the breakthroughs come in areas where you least expect them. So let's have a little bit of humility and accept that maybe that mental model we have of the right way to do this is not actually the exact way this is going to play out. And given time and opportunity, the creative minds of that global collective that have solved so many big problems along the way can tackle this one too. But we don't want to squash things in their infancy. We want to support and celebrate and see any positive step move forward rather than waiting for the silver bullet train to the finish line that never actually comes. Thank you.